Just get this kind of where I see about here.
Good morning. You made it to Sunday. This is good. These are the diehards that are here this morning. We appreciate it. It gives me great pleasure to introduce your next keynote speaker, Dr. Spencer McWilliams. Spencer is from California. He is a professor emeritus from the California State University at San Marcos. He has been a long-time life member with Constructivist Psychology Network. I think, Spencer, you started in 1979.
I went to my first international congress in 1979.
Yes, so it's been a long time. He has written over 79 articles and book chapters, and he is our president for probably the next few hours. So I would love to introduce you to Spencer McWilliams, and I look forward to his talk this morning.
Great. Thank you very much, Marla. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for showing up so early in the morning after that wonderful fireworks show and whatever parties went on after that. The title of my presentation, one of the things about doing these presentations, of course, is that we submit the title long before we actually write the presentation, so it sort of turns out to be a little different than I might have anticipated originally. They develop a life of their own. But I've called this the Shaking the Very Foundation, the Seduction of Certainty versus the Menace of Meaning-Making, and I'll explain what that means. Basically, what I'm suggesting is that a meaning-making way of looking at the world tends to shake up those who look at the world in a foundationalist kind of a way, okay? And I start my journey into this by asking the question that's a perennial question that the Constructivists have been asking themselves for, well, since the first time I ever went to a Constructivist conference. Why aren't more people joining in with us? We obviously make so much sense. Why are we the mainstream instead of those other people? Okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I learned from what the critics say about us, and I'll tell you how I got into that, and how I came to the view that there are two really incompatible views out there in terms of the critics and we meaning-making folks. And that leads me to a question about how people go about coming up with a view, how they adopt one of these views. And what is it that's appealing or seductive to people about each of these views? And what is it that each of these views finds threatening or menacing in the other viewpoint? And then I kind of come back to the question of how is it that we might draw more people who might be interested in the constructivist perspective, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that term in a more inclusive way in a second. And I'm going to suggest that there may be some ways that if we focus a little bit on a process orientation toward ontology, and take a look at what's currently going on in pragmatism, we might find some things that are useful to us in this regard. And since I know that most of you are probably practicing clinicians, and you're wondering, well, this is all very abstract and philosophical, I'm going to end by talking about how a pragmatic process method of professional practice has been proposed and how we might consider adopting and working with that. Okay? So I'm going to use the term constructivist, but it's going to refer to a lot of different perspectives, whether you're existentialist, phenomenalist, personal radical, social constructionist, a structural determinist, contextualist, pragmatist, Buddhist, postmodern, post-structural, narrative hermeneutic, etc., or even if you don't identify with any of these things. I'm suggesting that there are certain things that we have in common based on really the title of this conference, which is the construction of personal meaning. That is, we're assuming that meaning is something that people construct, not that they're born with a little tag attached to their toe that says, here's the meaning for your life. Okay? So I'm going to use the term constructivism, since those are the people I hang out with use that term. But keep in mind, every time I use the word constructivism, I'm referring to all of these approaches to things. So the question about why constructivism is mainstream, why doesn't everyone like it the way we do? There was an entire issue of the Journal of Constructivist Foundations a few years back. Can radical constructivism become a mainstream endeavor? Many articles and rebuttals and commentaries, and I will draw on some of those in my presentation today. But I found myself getting into this particular perspective in an interesting way. That was kind of serendipitous or accidental, and that is that a little over a year ago, I got some response from a reviewer, one of those anonymous reviewers, who had reviewed some of the material that I was writing on constructivist psychology. And the reviewer, one of the comments the reviewer made is that I was unwilling to respond to the critics like Barbara Held. Now, it was never clear to me how it was this reviewer happened to tap into my will, but I didn't think I needed to do that because John Raskin has taken on Barbara Held very effectively many, many times, and I didn't think there was any need to really take care of that anymore. So I hadn't included that. But so I first, as we usually do, I got angry at what the reviewer was saying, and then I accepted it, and then, went on with my business. But then I got to thinking, sometimes reviewers have a good point, okay? Not always, but sometimes. So I decided, maybe it would be useful for me in my understanding of constructivism and ability to articulate it to take a look at what these critics were saying. So I got Barbara Held's latest book, Psychology's Interpretive Turn. I looked at Boghossian's book and Bowden's Life, and a number of other people who are critics of constructivism, but I primarily focused on Held's book. Actually, when I had three different colors of highlighters. I had one highlighter that I used to highlight what she says about constructivists, and one that I used to highlight what she says about their point of view, and then another one for just if there were things that were interesting otherwise. So this book is all just totally marked up, and spent a lot of time with it. But I tried to do it using Kelly's sociality corollary idea, which is that I wanted to try to understand the critics from their own viewpoint. Okay, where were they coming from? What were they trying to do? And the viewpoint, as I came to understand it, there are very, very many terms for this. Of course, we're all familiar with this sort of foundationalist or realist or correspondence theory point of view. And for the talk today, I'm going to use the term objectivist, since that seems to be Barbara Held's preferred term, to refer to the outlook that they have. Okay? So we have these two different points of view. And one of the things that was really interesting about it was okay, I'm reading this thing, and I had this epiphany eventually. It took me a while to get to it. It's probably obvious to anybody else out here. But that I'm reading the criticisms of constructivism. And by the way, Barbara Held's book is largely a compendium of quotes from people who fall into various kinds of constructivist perspectives. Many of which, I'm looking at Bob and John and Jay sitting back there. They're quoted numerous times in there. She actually even has the same quotes repeated at various times throughout the book. And I've even suggested to students who wanted to learn about constructivism, it's a great book because there's such a great compendium of all of the quotes from all of the constructivists. So I'm reading this, and every time she's trotting out one of these quotes about what those nasty, stupid constructivists are saying, I say, well, that makes a lot of sense. I like that. That seems valid. And then when she's talking about the objectivist point of view, that she's contrasting it with, it's her point of view, which she seems to take for granted as being obvious that everybody would understand why this constructive stuff is nonsense, because of her point of view, she's describing the objectivist viewpoint, and I say, well, that doesn't make any sense. I don't see any value in that. That doesn't make any sense at all to me. And what I came to was a sense that most of the critics are taking as an assumption, as a given, the objectivist viewpoint. Okay, and we'll talk in a minute about how they define that objectivist viewpoint. And they criticize constructivism from that perspective. Is Alex Patakos here this morning? He may have already left. Okay, I'm going to use some Greek stuff here. So since he's not here, I don't have to worry about whether I'm making a mistake. But these folks are criticizing constructivism because it's not objectivism, and it reminds me of they sort of used the term for constructivists kind of like the term barbarian. Because the term barbarian is the Greek word for not Greek. So when you call somebody a barbarian, that just means that they're not. But so they call it a constructivist, they're saying, well, it's just that they're not us. Okay? So that was the sense that I had. And it takes me back to one of Kelly's famous statements that he said, when a person proposes a theory, they have two choices. They can claim that it was dictated to them by the reality of nature, or they can take personal responsibility for it as one person's hopeful construction of how things might work. And it struck me that really describes the difference between the critics, the objectivist point of view, and the constructivist point of view. That they're saying there's a nature out there that dictates the truth, and we're saying, we're just coming up with an idea that we hope might work for a while. Okay? So, talk a little bit about the objectivist perspective, and I'm going to quote Barbara Held here. An objectivist or realist ontology grants that there is a way that the world is, okay? and that this way that the world is independent of anybody's beliefs about how the world is. So there's this idea that there's a way that the world is on its own, it's prior to anybody coming along and trying to make sense of it. It has its own foundation, it's permanent, there are certain laws and principles that are built into it, there's an intrinsic character that exists in all of these things. And also there's the assumption here that human beings have the capacity to come to know what that objective truth is, even though it was already there before we came along. So the idea from the objectivist perspective is that for a belief to be true, it has to correspond to the way that the world is on its own. Otherwise, it's meaningless, okay? And that the truth is not determined by humans, but the truth is determined by the real nature of the things themselves. They're already there, okay? So there's this idea the objectivists have that out, and it's really funny that I've never quite been able to figure where out there actually is. It up there, or is it out there, or somewhere that it is independently of us? I think it all goes back to Plato's idea that there's this world of pure form somewhere independently of this degraded world we live in. But what I see in these folks is the idea that the ultimate good is to know the truth. They're always talking about the importance of knowing the truth. And the only true statements can be meaningful, okay? So if we're talking about how it is that we make meaning, from their perspective, meaning only occurs when it's the truth about the way the world is on its own. And that somewhere out there, uncontaminated by we human beings, is that truth, and it's important that we know it. I'm going to be giving many quotes from Richard Rorty, my favorite neo-pragmatist philosopher, but what he says about it is they believe that there are, out there in the world, real essences, which it is our duty to discover, okay? It's important for us to discover the truth, and that these essences are disposed to help us in doing that. Isn't it wonderful that we have been given that great opportunity to have the world help us to know what it is that it really is out there? Well, what I would suggest is that constructivism tends to shake the very foundation of this kind of point of view. So it's understandable that the objectivists would be unhappy with constructivism because it really just totally goes against their perspective. So what is this constructivist perspective? Well, some of you have been exposed to this for a long time, and others of you may have come across some of the other constructivist-oriented presentations, but basically, my short version of it is that basically that we humans have no direct access to an external world. We've evolved in such a way that we have certain sensory systems that respond to certain stimuli out there in the environment, and we react and try to figure out what to make of it, but we don't have any direct access beyond that. And that any viewpoint, any theory, any idea, any belief reflects human activity, human interests, human values. That is, that we're going to be interested in things that we care about, okay? And that, so all ideas and beliefs and customs and practices are things that human beings have invented. We do this in a context of language communities, so there's that social aspect of it. And there are lots of constraints on what it is that we might come up with in terms of the environment in which we live, our biology, society, language, etc. So we don't just come up with any old thing, but all ideas are things we've made up. And contrary to the view of the critics that this means that, well, any old idea is just as good as any other idea, I think most constructivists take the view that, well, some ideas work better than others. It would be nice to think that I could go up to the top floor of the hotel and flap my arms and go flying across the way, but if I tried that out, it probably wouldn't work so well, okay? So some ideas are more useful than other ideas. They help us to anticipate events better. I wouldn't really be interested in anticipating the event would occur if I did jump off the top of the building, although, as Jay was saying, it's so far so good on the way down, okay? So by developing these various viewpoints or ideas or beliefs or practices, we can help create more satisfying, fulfilling lives according to our human criteria. It's we humans that decide what it is that's better, how we want to live, what we think is good. But from a constructivist perspective, there's no reason that any ideas, even useful ideas, have to correspond to some external, extra-human reality. As long as they work and are useful for us, then so much the better. Okay? So what I've come to in looking at these critics and looking at our perspective is the notion that what we have here are two incommensurable views of the world, two totally incompatible ways of looking at things. Okay? We have all these arguments and debates. I know John has been very active in participating in them, but we have an objectivist viewpoint, a constructivist viewpoint. We have different assumptions about the nature of reality, different assumptions about knowledge, And it's easy to criticize each other because they don't agree with our assumptions, okay? The difference, of course, is when we criticize them as having one of a number of different ways of looking at things instead of where they say that they're right and we're wrong. But in a sense, there's no way of proving that objectivism is right or constructivism is right. And one of the things we have to recognize is that both of them actually work. So from a pragmatic perspective, the objectivist view actually enables people to function effectively in the world and to satisfy their needs and get along in the world. And many people have the common sense view that the world is exactly what we think it is. So it's hard to counter that. So, if you think about what do you need in order to have a debate or a discussion, you need to have some common place that you start from, and then you take different perspectives on it. But if there's no common ground, there's no way to really have a debate. So I've kind of come to the conclusion that debating with the foundationalists or the objectivists probably isn't terribly useful. And I doubt that we're going to have very many conversions from hardcore objectivists and somehow convince Barbara Held to come over and become a constructivist, for example. So that leads me to another question about how do people come up with their views? What determines whether someone tends to lean toward a constructivist view or an objectivist view? And I think of Bernstein says that basically what he's suggesting, he's one of the neo-pragmatist philosophers, is saying that it's really a clash of intuitions and temperaments. Kind of almost going back to William James and his tough-minded, tender-minded temperament distinction that he made very early on in terms of which branches of psychology people tend to go into. He said it's this clash of temperaments and intuitions that underlies and motivates many of the disputes about truth and justification and realism and objectivity. So what he's suggesting is it's not something very objective. In fact, he says, well, what does he mean by intuition? He says it's kind of like a hunch, okay? Or some sort of a pre-analytic sense of things. That is, that we have a sense of how we think the world is that seems to work for us and it seems compelling and we can't really think of any other way of looking at the world. And we can see this a lot. I've seen this so much in the people that I've come to know over the years in constructivism. We tell our stories about how we got interested in constructivism. I know I wrote about this myself. There's this sort of sense of coming across something that just, wow, hey, this really fits. This is really great. I really like this. This is what I've always kind of thought, but never was able to articulate. A sort of a feeling of, coming home. I found my home now among the constructivists, or that somehow here's somebody who's saying something that fits with my sort of tacit, unarticulated understanding. So it really does seem to me that, when I think of my own attraction to constructivism and other people, that it's not a logical, rational, figured out kind of a thing where you add up the numbers and do a t-test or something like that. It's more of a gut kind of a thing. So this takes me back to onto Richard Rorty's way of thinking about this. And what he suggests, he uses a concept, he looks at like the kind of the basic view we have of the world, how it is that the world looks to us, as what he calls the final vocabulary, okay? He says these are the words that people use to justify their beliefs and justify their actions, to decide who to praise and who to have contempt for, to tell the story of their lives. It's the way we look at the world. And he suggests that the person's final vocabulary consists of terms like true, good, right, beautiful, those kind of terms at the higher level, and then at the slightly subordinate level, terms like professional standards, or what decency is, or what kindness or rudeness is, or what progressive means, or those sort of slightly subordinate aspects. But basically, they're the construct dimensions, what Kellyans would probably think of as core constructs, the way we look at the world. And what Rorty points out, and goes along with what Bernstein was also saying about the intuitive aspect of it, is that we're not able to further justify or defend the final vocabulary that we use. That is, our basic ideas about what's real and what's meaningful and what's true and what's good. We can't really explain that in any kind of rational sense. And most people, from the common sense point of view, just take for granted that the way that we talk about the world, that vocabulary that I grew up around, that I've learned from everybody, that it is an accurate and useful and effective representation of the world. And those of us in personal construct psychology know about the laddering of constructs to get up to core constructs. When you're laddering constructs, you're asking people, what's the advantage of this value and that value? And when they get to the point where they're saying, oh, that's, I don't know, it just feels right, or that's the way it is, or something like that, then you know you've reached the top of that ladder. But that ladder is not something that can be further justified or further defended. It's just the way it is. Okay? So it makes sense to me to think that which direction we're drawn is kind of based on this intuitive feeling that we have, and we just find ourselves feeling at home with others. So, but what's interesting to me about the way Rorty describes this is he talks about people that he calls ironists. Okay, the ironists, I think, the idea that who believe that things aren't quite what we say they are, and I would suggest that the ironists that Rorty talks about are the people who would be the candidates for constructivism. That is, the people who might be interested in joining our fold were they to come across us. And what he says is that, many people, of course, most people are completely satisfied with the final vocabulary that they're brought up with. Okay? What everybody else in their neighborhood talks about, they're perfectly happy with it. But there are some of us who doubt the current final vocabulary that they're using, the one that they grew up around, what other people are using. And they find themselves captivated by other vocabularies, maybe from people they've met, maybe from some of these college professors who are giving them these strange ideas, trying to corrupt them, maybe from books that they've read. And they can't resolve their doubts about their current vocabulary in terms of that present vocabulary. Okay? Because, again, within that vocabulary, everything is going to work out the way it says it's supposed to. So they seek better ways of talking, better ways of acting. They're interested in finding out new ideas. They're open to different perspectives. And he goes on talking about how, the people like this are sort of worried that somehow they got initiated into the wrong tribe. That somehow, they've been taught the wrong language game. Like, how did I end up in this family, And they're afraid that we're going to get stuck in this vocabulary that just, it is going to make their life meaningless, okay? There's no meaning for them in that vocabulary. So they seek out strange people and strange communities, like constructivists. They come across these different ideas. And I find this a lot, in students. You see that the students who, when you start talking about strange ideas, nod their heads instead of the ones that go like this, and then they come to your office hour and stuff. They're looking for an alternative because the way that they've been living their whole life just doesn't seem to work for them. And I find this expressed very nicely by the famous constructivist poet and singer Leonard Cohen. We all know of his constructivist orientation. In his piece, Democracy, he says, it's coming from the feel that it ain't exactly real, or that it's real, but it ain't exactly there. This doesn't quite seem to be the way it works. So that's that kind of an intuitive sense. Okay, so if we think about that, people who are drawn toward objectivism or drawn toward constructivism are drawn to it from this intuitive kind of a sense. Well, what's the appeal of objectivism? And I would suggest that the major appeal of the objectivist view is the seduction of certainty, because it holds out the idea that there's a truth there. That humans have this powerful human desire to have a coherent understanding of the world, tie their beliefs and ideas together in a way that's lucid and meaningful. And for many people, well, it's just common sense to assume that the world is the way we think it is. Why are you talking about all this stuff? What's wrong with you? They say, well, these ideas have worked so far. We managed to navigate our way around the world without bumping into things. So what's the problem? What we think is there is really there. That's what it is. Very comfortable. And one of the issue on the radical constructivism and being mainstream, one of the authors was saying, that for most people, there's enough stability between their descriptions of the world and their experience of the world that it works just fine. They have no motivation, no interest in considering an alternative. It's much more comfortable. It's less taxing. Most people don't want to have to talk about these things or think about these things. Okay, so we can see why, and I think this is one thing that was important to me coming out of this little journey here, is to see why it is that most people are totally comfortable with an objectivist, realist, foundationalist point of view. It works fine for them, and they don't want to take the time and trouble to deal with it. So why is meaning-making, that constructivist way of looking at things, such a menace to people who like the objectivist point of view? Why don't they like it? Well, it's threatening to those core beliefs, right? Okay, The idea that you're saying that everything I think I know, I sort of think that you tell someone everything you think you know is totally wrong, and they're supposed to say, oh, thank you, I'm so glad you told me that, right? No, it's like, I don't want to hear that. And one of the things that it does, too, is it removes an extra human sense of authority. The idea that somewhere out there is a truth that we can hold on to. And it leaves people without a feeling of a sense of clear reality or truth or morality. What am I going to do? How do I behave if there's no way that things are out there? If there's an idea and they have this idea that if we say that we can't know a reality independent of our mind, that they think that means that we don't think there is a reality independent of our mind. But it's way too much responsibility for people, for most folks, to get into the notion that we have to take responsibility for these things. And I'll just briefly talk about what I see as and I know John has talked about these many, many times, the sort of three, what I'm regarding as straw man criticisms of constructivism, in the sense that I think it's based on a misunderstanding of constructivism, the notion that constructivists are anti-realist, the notion that we believe in relativism, and the notion that anything goes. So briefly, objectivists think we can know a way that the world is. So if we say we can't know the way the world is, then for them, as I just said, that means that we don't think there is a world. If we say there's no way we can know the world as it exists independently of human processes, they somehow take the idea that we mean that we don't think there is a world independently of human processes, that we don't really think there's a reality out there. Well, that's not really the way constructivists think, but that's, when you look at it from an objectivist perspective, it's logical that you would go that way. And that's threatening to their objectivist sense of the way reality is. Okay, well, what about the relativity thing? Well, the contrast pole of relativity is absolute. Okay? So to say that something is relative means it's not absolute, but if you believe that there is an absolute truth, then of course any alternative to that is going to be regarded as relativist. And if humans construct the truth, it can't be absolute. So that means that there's no sense of certainty. It destroys that sense of certainty. So again, I see this as a misinterpretation of what constructivism really says. Well, then there's the anything goes thing, okay? And it's the argument that, well, so you're saying any idea is just as good as any other idea. And I sort of think about Paul Feyerabend's work on this in terms of the history of science, in which he's basically saying that there's no way to predict ahead of time what methodology is going to lead to new discoveries. So the only, in his epistemological anarchy, says the only statement that really works is to say anything goes. And my own perspective on it is to say, well, yes, anything goes in the sense of trying it out, but not everything actually goes. Okay? So we can try things out, but we still got to see whether they actually work or not. And we don't know ahead of time what is going to go and what's not going to go. We just have to try these things out. And of course, we've talked a lot about all the different constraints on the kinds of constructs and interpretations that people can come up with. And Rorty says, even if there is no way the world is, there's still pressures that influence the relationships between features of the environment and the holding of true sentences. And we'll see what he means by true sentences. He's not saying true with a capital T. And one of the things that we need to remember is that all of our descriptions of nature and our descriptions of ourselves are based on our human needs, our human interests, our human concerns. So anything doesn't go, but let's be open to anything. So again, I see these three criticisms as being a kind of a misinterpretation and a straw man version, a made up kind of extreme version. And that's my perspective on them. Okay? Well, why does constructivism appeal to some of us? Okay? Why do we like it? Well, again, looking at it from this intuitive, gut level kind of a perspective, we like it because it gives us alternatives. It gives us choices. Okay? It gives support to making meaning. If things were the way we think they are, then there's no way to make any meaning out of it. We don't have to accept just one viewpoint. There are all alternatives and options. We don't have to disprove one idea in order to consider an alternative. And a quote from Faye Francella, the late Faye Francella, who was a major contributor in personal construct psychology, said, what drew her to it? She says, I could change myself. I didn't have to be what people said I should be. Quite powerful stuff, he says. Okay? I think that's the kind of intuitive thing that draws people to constructivism. Well, if objectivists can be threatened by constructivism, why would constructivists be threatened by objectivism? Okay? Well, It threatens our core beliefs, our core constructs, okay? But, and this is a Buddhist interpretation of the same concept here, but it's the idea that if the world were real, as the way the objectivists think it is, with its own innate, built-in, absolute, permanent ways that it is, it would take away hope. It would take away meaning. There would be nothing we could do. If the truth existed in a permanent, independent, forever kind of a way, then nothing would ever change. Nothing we humans do would matter, although that fits in nicely with Jay's presentation yesterday, which suggests that it doesn't matter that it doesn't matter. But there would be no place for human agency, for human audacity that the constructivists talk about, for progress, for change, because if things were fixed in the way that they were, then nothing would change and there's nothing we could do about it. So those are some of the things that we don't like about the objectivist view. We also have some criticisms about some of the failure of their point of view, which is that people have been looking for the objective way to determine how the world is on its own in the Western society for 3,000 years, and we've never found a way to grasp what a mind-independent reality would be like. We haven't found a way to show that there's a way that the world is, or what that world is. We haven't been able to figure out what it is that our representations actually represent. So we've never been able to figure out a criterion for justifying the truth of any idea. So I'll be talking more about Richard Rorty later, but basically what he says is that, well, we've tried this for like thousands of years and haven't gotten anywhere. Well, we should just change the subject. Maybe we should talk about something else other than the objective truth. And one of the best examples I give, here's another Greek reference here, the ancient Greek sophist Gorgias. Basically the way he said it is like, well, let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, this is a second argument, so we already said didn't think that was going to be. Let's suppose for the sake of argument that there is a way that the world is, okay? And let's suppose that we have a human view of the way the world is. How could we possibly know whether our human view is identical with the way the world really is? So he says, well, we need an independent judge who could look and understand the way the world is and look at our view and say, you're getting warm, or you're really off in left field. Okay, but there's no way that we humans can have a judge independently of we humans to do that. So there's no way we could ever know, even if there is a way the world is, whether our ideas correspond to it. So let's just change the subject. Let's give up on that. Well, then of course people are going to say, well, what about science? Doesn't science give us the truth? Okay, science, in science uncovers the truth. It discovers things. They were there all along before humans came along, and we discovered it, like Einstein's, walking across the field there in Switzerland, pondering these ideas, and he trips over a rock, and up jumps this little kid and says, "Hi, I'm the theory of relativity. Let me introduce myself to you." Like it was there all along. But what we see that there's been a tremendous amount of work in the sort of philosophy, history, and sociology of scientific knowledge over the last 50 years, continuing on up to this day. And we were familiar with Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper and some of those folks. One of my favorite folks these days is a guy named Andy Pickering, who started out his career as a nuclear physicist and then got into studying the process of how physicists come up with ideas. And I came across his first book called Constructing Quarks that describes how the physicists constructed the idea of quarks. And he calls the whole scientific process a mangle. It's this messy process that, based on the tools that people have available to them at the time, and and he ultimately he says that it became implausible for him to imagine that scientific knowledge literally corresponds to the inner constitution of nature. So does that mean that we need to be anti-science if we're constructivist? Well, no, I don't think we need to be anti-scientist, but we might want to be anti-correspondence. That is, we can see science as a beautiful human achievement. It's something that humans have done. It's a human activity, a human accomplishment. It's very useful to us, helps us to predict events, helps us to predict actions, helps to predict consequences of various kind of actions. But we don't have to see it as an accurate representation of the world itself. Again, to quote Rorty, he says, the vocabulary which happens to be handy in predicting and controlling nature is not nature's own vocabulary, even though Galileo thought it was, okay? And one of my favorite quotes on Rorty on science, he says, modern science does not enable us to cope because it corresponds to reality. It just plain enables us to cope, okay? So if we have this notion that there are these two different points of view, and that there may be some people who might be inclined to be interested in a constructivist point of view if they came across it, the ironists who are questioning their particular point of view. Are there things that we might be able to do to help constructivism be more accessible and more appealing to people? So that's my question, those people who are looking for alternatives. Well, one way I'd like to suggest is that we take a look at the issue of ontology. Now, many constructivists have articulated very, very persuasively and convincingly that constructivism doesn't need an ontology, ontology being, the study of being itself or reality. And I agree with that we don't really need it, but maybe the lack of a convincing ontology may hinder ironists from being able to adopt a constructivist point of view. And in the special issue on radical constructivism in the mainstream, one of the authors says that the challenge to common sense realism prevents constructivism from becoming mainstream. That most people, even if people are open to new ideas, they may still think that we're saying that there's no reality out there. So is there a way that we could acknowledge a reality that goes on existing independently of human beings without assuming there's a foundation to it, or there's essence to it, or there's a truth out there that we can come up with, or that ideas are going to correspond with it? Well, a lot of people are suggesting that we might, if we look at ontology from a process perspective, we might be able to address some of these things. That is, if we viewed phenomenal reality as an ever-changing web of interdependent relationships, rather than the objectivist viewpoint that sees reality as a container of independent, permanent substances that have stable laws and principles that explain what they do, that might be a way of doing it. And my last Greek reference here will be to Heraclitus, who's talked about this way, way back in the olden days, that you can't step in the same river twice, things are always changing. That was the big debate that went on in the Greeks between is the world always changing, or are there fixed stable laws? Unfortunately, the stable law people became more popular. So what would be the advantage of a process way of looking at things? Well, one thing is that we could avoid the charge that we're anti-realist if we say, no, we believe there's a reality out there, okay? Although it's different from how other folks might look at it. And it would help us to focus more on here and now events that are going on, rather than the idea that we're nailing down absolute truths. So what I'm going to do is to give some examples of process ontologies within some constructivist-related kinds of perspectives. First, I'll start with personal construct psychology. George Kelly. George Kelly stated his view of the universe in his original book. He said, the universe is really existing, that it's an integral unit with all parts related, and that it's always in a process of motion and change. Okay? Sound good? Well, let me mention some key points in this. One is that, what I like is that if you look at what Kelly says, he's using the gerund form, existing. Okay? He's not saying the world, he says it is existing. Well, existing by its very nature is a verb. Okay? And it's not something that stays put and sticks in one place. So he says that the job of human beings is to anticipate events. Okay, events are processes. Events are not things. Not to sort of, he says, trace permanent features of the world. So we're not trying to nail down the truth about things. All we're trying to do is to see if in this process that we're a part of, we can anticipate additional processes. I also see the same thing in the Buddhist perspective. The Buddhist perspective, or at least particularly the Madhyamaka perspective, suggesting that phenomena really are existing, but they arise and fall away in interdependent relationships with other phenomena. Okay? So, as a result of that, phenomena are impermanent. Nothing stays the same. Nothing is fixed. And because there's no permanent nature to the phenomena that we experience, we can't identify any innate essence or existing essence that determines the characteristics of these objects. Their behavior is determined by the other processes that they interact with. Another way of describing it is to say that reality is an assemblage of interlocking physical and mental processes. They spring up and they pass away, subject to various conditions, and they're always mediated by some kind of human activity, human cognitive activity, because it's we humans who talk about things rather than just having the process continue to go on. So there's another perspective. Also in radical constructivism, we see in 2011 in the Journal of Constructivist Foundations that Schmidt proposes a kind of a rewrite of radical constructivism based on a process view. He says, this may be a way of dissolving the debate between objectivism and constructivism by saying, let's focus on processes, not objects or entities, okay? Let's emphasize how we come to know things, and we see knowledge itself as a process, knowledge as a performance of an actor who was talking about language and action. Also, the neo-pragmatists were familiar with these 20th century sociologists and historians and philosophers of science, and they basically kind of had abandoned the idea that science is going to lead to the truth. So we're going to take things from a different perspective, and there's a number of people who are well-known of the neo-pragmatist folks that I've listed here briefly. And I want to talk specifically about Richard Rorty. He's one of my favorites, and also has this very wonderful way of putting things that I really like. So Richard Rorty, he died, I think, in 2006 or 2008 or something, relatively recently, so he's a relatively contemporary. Richard Bernstein says that the vigorous international discussion of pragmatism today is largely due to Rorty's provocation. And I think the provocation is a very appropriate choice of words here, that he was very provocative and really liked to sort of stir things up, but he generated a whole lot of discussion. So what Rorty says is what matters for pragmatists is devising ways to diminish human suffering and increase human equality. Sound good? Everybody ready for that? So, I mean, that's where we're coming from. That's what's important to a pragmatist. And human inquiry, we no longer are assuming that human inquiry has to do with corresponding to the intrinsic nature of reality. Okay, we've let go of that idea. So the purpose of human inquiry is to address human needs and human problems. And particularly, he used the word transient, to point out that human needs and human problems are transient. Problems arise and fall away under different conditions and different circumstances, okay? So we want to try to solve these transient human problems. And the key point about this we'll be coming back around to is that if it's a transient human problem, the solution to it is useful for having solved that problem, but it doesn't mean that that solution can be generalized now to all of human nature. So that the questions, he's saying, the questions we want to ask from this pragmatist perspective is, what should we do? What is it we want to accomplish or achieve? How should we go about it? Okay? It's up to us. It's a very democratic perspective. Let's get together and figure out how we solve this particular problem. We have a good example of how not to do this in the U.S. Capitol in Washington, where we have a Congress whose job is to not solve any problems, okay, because they can't get together on it. Well, what about truth? Well, one of the things that pragmatists point out is that anything that we call human knowledge only comes to us in the form of a verbal expression made by a human being. Okay? Only human beings say what they think things are. There's no place where knowledge exists independently of humans. So the concept of truth can only be applied to a sentence uttered by a human being. Now, to me, this is really interesting to chew on this one. Okay, that can I say is this table true? Well, you got to look at me and say what I mean by that. We don't. Or is that a true tree out there? No, it's only a sentence, a statement of proposition made by a human being that falls within the range of convenience of the truth versus falsity dimension. Okay? Only a description of the world could be true or false, depending on what we mean by true. And he says, so when we talk about truth, what we're talking about is a guide to human action. Okay? Not an accurate representation of the way the world is in a non-human way, but more like say, well, what we mean by a true idea is one that seems to be a better way of acting and we can't find any alternative to it. This is basically the way Gorgias talked about it way back in the early Greeks. He's saying that truth is a prize that we give to the ideas that are so persuasive that we can't think of any good alternative to them. Okay? We give them the prize of being the truth. But Rorty also says that we should think of the term truth as a signpost of caution, because what we mean by truth is just the idea that we have at this point that seems like it's the best way to do things, and we don't have a better alternative, but it's likely that at some point in the future we will come up with a better alternative, or this way isn't going to work. So saying that it's true means it's the best way we've come up with to act now, but it doesn't mean we've found the ultimate truth. So what about this relationship between truth and reality? Because this is what the objectivists are into. Well, truth has to correspond to reality. Okay. Ooh, okay. So Rorty says we should distinguish between claims that the world is out there and claims that the truth is out there. Okay? The world exists regardless of what human beings think about it. There's no need to think that in addition to the world, there's something out there called the truth about the world. The world's just going on about its business. The world doesn't care what descriptions we use. The world doesn't think that some of our theories about it are better than other theories about it. And Rorty also supports a process orientation to say that there's no intrinsic nature, no self-identity, independent of our descriptions, and that all of our descriptions are related to human needs and interest in language, and every term that we use can be dissolved into a relationship. So he says there's relations all the way up, all the way down, all the way out. Everything is just one more relationship. Another thing he talks about that we talk about a lot in psychology is that is it important for us to have a unified understanding, that our knowledge be unified so we have one single theory that accounts for everything. And what he's saying is if we think of a true belief as just something that outshines its rivals as a basis for action, then there's no need to think that that truth has to be one seamless thing. We come up with different truths or different ideas to deal with different situations, and the kind of terms that we use to describe human meaning-making don't necessarily have to fit in nicely with the terms that we use to describe how our blood corpuscles work. So we don't have to reconcile all of our beliefs with each other. So we need to be open to diversity and plurality and give support to human agency and audacity in coming up with new ideas. And we need to be very careful about assuming that something that worked as a truth at one point should be generalized beyond that. We need to avoid thinking that because we have an idea that worked once, we've somehow now tapped into the truth about the way the world is. Saying this is something that worked and let's give it a go. And in the terms of the issues about hope and meaning, Rorty says, well, if we think of truth as statements we make describing ways of behaving and acting that are useful to us, then the search for truth is basically the same thing as the search for human happiness. Because it's we humans who are deciding what is true and what the problems are. So we're only relying on ourselves. And what he suggests is that as we come to rely on ourselves, we can free ourselves from what he calls Nietzsche's longest lie that says that somewhere outside of human activity, out there somewhere, lies something, whether it's religion or science or rationality or what, that is, if we do the right things, that is, use the right statistics in the right experimental conditions and stuff, or whatever it is going to step in and save us. Okay? We come to the idea that it's we humans, knowledge is all created by humans, and it's up to us. There's nobody out there who's going to help us. Okay, the last pragmatist I want to talk about very briefly is a more modern 21st century pragmatist, Joseph Margolis. He's written several books on pragmatism's advantage in pragmatism. This is actually was going to be a trilogy, and now there are 4 of them. And basically what he's saying is we need to focus on human processes. And we need to understand human processes as a product of biological evolution, and that it's human processes that are central to the development of knowledge. Okay? There's no knowledge without human beings developing it. And he describes how we can view the human self as kind of an artifact of evolution. That we have the species Homo sapien evolving over time, and using Darwinian notions to say that there are various kind of mutations that some tend to be useful. At some point over the course of human evolution, we develop control over our vocal apparatus and begin to use words. Okay? And as we begin to use words, we begin to develop culture in which we have descriptions of the events around us and descriptions of our world. And he describes that as a unique contingent process. It's not something divinely inspired. It's like other animals. We've evolved, and we happen to evolve this ability to speak and to develop cultures around that. And it's out of that cultural process with language that we invent the notion that there's a sense of self, there's an agent or a person who's doing all of this. And so he describes the human as what he calls a biological cultural hybrid. We can't explain human activity totally in terms of biological terms. There's nothing in our biology that can explain culture. Happens to be that we developed language and we developed culture out of that. But as we have infants and we raise our infants, they become enculturated in the language and the culture too. So we have concepts like the world and the self and other people. But all these are artifacts of our internalized language and culture. So what he's suggesting is that humans are the only agents and subjects out there in the world that we find in the natural world, and that we generate knowledge without any kind of transcendental or privileged presumptions of any kind. I know I'm at the end of my time, but we started a little bit late, so let me just go on for a few more minutes, and I'll do this relatively quickly. So Margolis is supportive of constructivism, but he's saying that the real world is not a construction of our mind, but knowledge, he says, is confined to humans. Okay? If anything is going to be true or valuable, it depends on human initiative and human inquiry. It's not something that is lying around out there telling us that it's important or valuable to us. And that any adequate picture of the world is going to come in the form of a human utterance. So it's we humans out there doing these things. So why do I say that pragmatism might be useful for constructivism? Well, it supports a process perspective. It extends many of the fundamental constructivist views that were originally developed from a pragmatist perspective, but into new, more modern ways of looking at things. It emphasizes the total human-based aspect of knowledge. It puts all the responsibility on us. It says it's up to us to come up with these things. And it might appeal to the potential constructivists, to ironists, to have this pragmatic perspective developed a little bit more. Also, there have been some really good professional applications, and I'll talk about that very briefly, but I want to leave something for those of you who are clinicians who are wondering, what does all this have to do with us? And when we look at professional psychology, at clinical counseling, educational, all of this, that there's a guy named Daniel Fishman who wrote a book back in 1999 called The Case for a Pragmatic Psychology, what he's calling a pragmatic case study method of doing professional work. Another article just recently that by him and one of his colleagues that I'm drawing from. And he says, that the traditional notion that applied psychology should be based on what is done in the laboratory really doesn't really work, because it assumes that there's some kind of underlying context-free, value-free laws and principles. It's kind of the Boulder model kind of a notion, the idea that we work in the laboratory and then apply it. And he says that doesn't really work in clinical practice. So he sees clinical practice as professional activity, disciplined inquiry. We begin with problems with real clients in a real context, in a real situation. We figure out how to solve their problems. We apply our skills and our ingenuity, as you folks are doing all the time, to try to improve that, and recognize that we're doing it subjectively. We're looking at it in terms of a context. We have perspectives that we use. And he's going to say, let's use the postmodernist pragmatic way of looking at things, but let's borrow scientific methodology, but only to help us to achieve particular goals of evaluating whether our processes are working, not trying to come up with underlying laws. And I'll quickly run through these different themes that he talks about in terms of novelty and change, how what he's talking about is very supportive of what we constructivists do. And what he's suggesting is that we look at theories and methods and techniques as tools, not competing for the true one, just trying out different ones. He says it's probably better to even try to use contradictory methods, see what happens. And even our generalizations are going to be human activities. They're not a description of the world in itself. And what he suggests is that professional psychology focus on the specific case study, a specific case in a single context as the basic unit of analysis. He's developed a peer-reviewed journal where people submit case studies, and organizing the case studies into cases with similar goals and similar interventions, developing a computerized database, basically kind of something similar to the legal field, where we have this large database of cases that people can consult and look and see what actually works. And I noted in the most recent issue of Journal of Constructivist Psychology that I received just as I was preparing this, that there's an article by Gary Schneemeyer and Bailey on exploring maternal grief, and that this article uses the pragmatic mixed methods kind of approach that Fishman was talking about, and I was happy to see that occurring. Okay, so I'd just like to close with one quote from another famous constructivist, just to kind of pull this all together. And this quote starts out, it says, "You tend to be told that the world is the way that it is. But life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is that everything around you that you call life was made up by people no smarter than you. And once you learn that, you'll never be the same again." That famous constructivist, of course, Steve Jobs. Okay? So thank you very much. I wish we had time for questions and comments and rebuttals.
All I can say is, wow. You've taken us through the history of science. Because we have to divide the rooms up, I wonder if we could take our conversation out into the hall, into the lobby here, because we have tea and coffee. And we wanted to try to understand about the filming of these sessions. Lillian, they will be put up on YouTube at the end of the Congress? Okay, because people have been asking me for access to many of the keynote speakers' addresses, so we would like to be able to get out to you a website or a link where you can view these talks. Thank you all for coming this morning, and thank you, Spencer, so much. That was absolutely phenomenal.
Great, thank you. My pleasure.
So enjoy your coffee break.
Actually, the conference physically will be ended by 5 o'clock today, but virtually the conference continues. So this afternoon at lunchtime, each organization will have their annual general meeting, and the lunch will be provided. And if you are members, please attend. If you're not a member, please join and be a member so that we could continue these conversations. Thank you.